Yeah, I had to tap out on Vox Machina when the bard gnome shot a enemy with a pink lightning bolt from his dick.
So you, like, did your humor bone die?
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
And I'm still Eliot.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you all for joining us today. Today we are going to be talking from the DM's perspective, from a campaign creation perspective. We're going to be talking about creating and running antagonists, specifically the types of antagonists who, for one reason or another, are untouchable by the player characters, whether that's more often than not my experience with having, quote, untouchable antagonists. The untouchable status is something that is gatekept merely by the fact that the enemy is particularly powerful, generally too powerful to take down in some way or another. What have you guys actually experienced? Because one of my main reasons for having this as the topic today was I was reading some information about the upbringing of the man who would become Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany during World War I, and reading about his upbringing and the fact that pretty much everybody around him who was competent was just like, oh man, this guy is going to be a disaster when he becomes Kaiser. Well, let's just throw up our hands because this is the monarchy system and there's not a goddamn thing we can do about it. So everybody pull down your pants and bend over because we're all about to get fucked.
Well, there's a story that I always tell on this subject. I wonder if Jordan can predict which one it is. Can you remember the name of the untouchable villain that got touched really hard in a game we played once upon a time?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had to dig back in the archives a little bit. This is the Vader story?
Yeah. I guess the lesson to be learned from this story is, you know, when you say untouchable villains, I don't think it's not a bad thing to have. I think most games have them, and I guess they play a necessary part. But if you're going to run an untouchable villain, do not allow them to be touched. Because a perfect example is we were playing in a Star Wars game, and the DM thought he was going to be real cheeky and roll out Darth Vader in the first couple of sessions, thinking that we would just be scared out of our wits and run away. And of course, our Wookiee, murder hobo in the party was like, fuck him. And he charged him and took a shot with his bowcaster, and the DM's like, why are you doing this? You literally can't kill him. And he had a 320s rule in his game that this murder hobo made him reaffirm and said, you got to give me at least three rolls for 20s. And long story short, rolls 3 20s, Vader's head pops off, game ends, no more game. So just for the outset, when you're making your bad and you feel like they need to be untouched, make sure the players can't touch them, because if you give them the chance, they will try and put you in an awkward position.
See, I want to make a distinction here because your example is not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about literally, in this first example, too powerful to take down. I'm thinking like Sauron in Lord of the Rings, because he was literally not in corporeal form, or in Curse of Strahd himself at the very beginning of the campaign. The player characters cannot possibly do dick to him at the very beginning of the campaign. Another example from the 90s, the shows Hercules and Xena. Their main antagonists on both of those series were the gods themselves. They weren't going to be killing the gods. They were going to be every day defeating the gods' machinations thwarting the gods' machinations, but they were never going to stop Ares from being Ares.
Yeah, you need to have some kind of magical system in place to be able to do it that way. I think if you're doing something in a realistic modern setting, the best that you can hope for, if provided that you're actually going to have the villain present and not just like showing up on a TV screen or on the other end of a phone call or something. If they're actually in the same vicinity as the player characters, the only thing you can do is to make it a suicide mission if they do go after them. I mean, that's, how world leaders stay alive for the most part. You've got like rings of security around a VIP. And I mean, I guess it's theoretically possible that somebody could, load themselves up with like Ebola or something and, go shake the hand of a senator or some shit and somehow like get in there and do it. That's, the whole like terrorist strategy. But assuming that your player characters, that your players want to continue playing those characters, they're not going to go for the, bomb vest approach. So,
lately I've been thinking about, a potential future game, more of a setting than anything else, but where there is no, and maybe we're getting too far away from the topic here, but I personally have gotten to where I kind of want to get away from the Sauron ultimate evil, antagonist, because it does, it's tropey, most games are that. Maybe at least most of the games I play and run. And it can grab hold of the story a little bit. I feel like when you have this unbeaten foe that you're trying to build your players up to be able to conquer, you create like you were saying, like gates where, it's like, well, the level 5 arc ends in them defeating Lieutenant number 1. And then, arc level 5 to 10, they defeat Lieutenant number 2. And you just kind of stair-step the players up to ultimately defeating this bad guy. But then at that point, though, what you're doing is you're kind of writing the players' futures for them. And then it puts a lot of pressure on you as the game master to really run a game where your antagonist is engaging enough for them to want to do something. I mean, obviously, if you're heroes and, you've got this big bad that's just, sending armies willy-nilly to lay waste to, villages that are innocent or whatever, that's going to create a natural antagonism. But once again, that just seems real tropey. I don't know. How do you guys feel about the one big bad to rule them all kind of approach to gaming?
I'm also very bored of it, and that's one of many reasons why I'm running my current game in Greyhawk, because there's a shitload of, people who fancy themselves some, Omega tier Dark Lord. You got Vecna, you got Caraptus, you got a Sararak, you got Ayuz, you got Lolth. Like, there's just shitloads of Dark Lords all over the place. And they fight with each other. They fight with, the humans and all that stuff. But, like, there's not really this, ultimate evil bad guy. I mean, some of the, like, super huge evil gods might sort of act like that for a campaign if you've got, like, Orcus or somebody like that as the focal point. But there's, so many really powerful evil characters that I think I like that approach better than just having one target. It makes the story more dynamic. It, makes things a lot more unpredictable, I think.
Yeah, I'm also very tired of the one big bad to rule them all. And Jordan, you touched on something that I definitely wanted to go into as a way you can avoid doing that, where you mentioned all of those deities, demi-deities, or near demi-deities in power, individuals. All of those individuals were at the top of a hierarchy. Like in the example of Lolth. Lolth is on the 666th layer of the Abyss. So, you're not going to be going there and doing anything to her because she is not on the planet that you are on. You have to deal with all of the things that are going on the planet. And you're not fighting her, you're fighting her institution. And I think that having like institutionalized enemies is a good way of getting around that monolithic evil where you can have an entire organization where there is no particular, there is no one singular head, there is no like single pope of the religion of Loth. There's the high priestess in each one of the drow cities or whatever, but I mean, you kill that one high priestess, there's going to be a lot more acolytes around to become the next high priestess as well. It kind of follows the Hydra model from Marvel Comics.
Yeah, for sure. And they're super conniving too. Like the way that they describe how gods get power from their followers through worship, it doesn't have to be directly like I'm making this sacrifice to Lolth or whoever. A lot of these evil gods will have fake cults with some made up deity that's, you know, some alter ego or just some completely contrived religion to hook in a bunch of people, and they still get all that, you know, worshiper spirit energy or whatever. And there might be, you know, multiple layers of that going on. Like, they're tricky. You know, you got to remember these are millennia old genius level entities, and even if they do show up physically, the only thing that's showing up is like an avatar or an aspect or whatever. You kill that thing, but like the only way to actually kill these things is, like you were saying, go to the 666th layer of the abyss and somehow kill Loth right there, and good luck.
Yeah, and at that point you're not just trying to kill an individual, you're not just trying to kill a deity, you're trying to kill an idea, because Lolth is the goddess of darkness. How are you going to eliminate darkness from the world to cut off her source of power?
Yeah, and when that shit does happen, if, you know, one god kills another one, or, you know, some evil deity wipes out another evil deity, they just absorb their whole portfolio of powers, and so that same evil shit is still out there lingering in the cosmos. It's just under the domain of some other character. Like, it doesn't disappear. That's why all these things are, you know, presented as these cyclical, you know, infinite conflicts throughout eternity. There's no way to like actually win any of these wars.
You know, lately the way I've been trying to think about antagonists in game is I went back and rewatched a few weeks ago Kingdom of Heaven. Have you guys seen that movie lately?
Is that Liam Neeson, the Crusader movie?
Yeah.
Am I thinking of the right thing?
It's Ridley Scott. I gave it thumbs up. It's a good movie. I mention it because I think about the antagonist in that movie was Saladin. I think that's the name of the guy. The Muslim general who eventually defeated the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The King of Jerusalem and Saladin actually had a fairly diplomatic, friendly relationship, but they were just natural enemies. And regardless of their personal, you know, feelings towards one another or their personal goodness or badness, you know, one was a Christian Crusader king, one was a Muslim, a Muslim leader of Islam, and there's no reconciling those two things. And figuring out a way to put that kind of tension in a game, I think, is more something that I find myself thinking about more whenever I'm looking at creating a future game, rather than having your antagonists be just these pure evil, you know, cackling fiends. You know, just put your players at odds with the motivation and see where the chips fall. I mean, and in most of those cases, like, you know, you had mentioned the Wilhelm, you know, in reality, mano y mano, Wilhelm's not a formidable individual. You know, if a couple of soldiers would just face off against him as an individual, they're gonna wax him. But it would be the implications of him dying or being replaced that would be. It's almost like his armor and his power is is he has institutional armor, kind of like you were saying with cutting with Hydra. Like, what keeps them from just being offed is like, what's the alternative, and bringing that kind of concept of an antagonist into a game, I think is something I think a lot about these days.
Yeah, and from the historical perspective, kingdoms went to war all the time, and nobody was really the evil person in the war. Like, both sides vilified their enemies, but when you look back, there was no good side and there was no bad side. That is a narrative that we have managed to create or managed to become a part of popular culture since probably World War II, where we actually have, those guys really were doing some very fucking bad shit and they needed to be stopped. If you go back to World War I, it's a bunch of soldiers in the field just dying because their countries were telling them to do it, and a bunch of vainglorious generals who got them into the mess to begin with. There wasn't some evil, hand-wringing, mustache-twirling villain behind it all. If you went back in time and managed to assassinate Wilhelm II in 1905, congratulations, you started World War I 9 years earlier. Good for you.
There was the good and evil narrative in the Middle Ages for like the Crusades, though. It was, the Pope would issue edicts about how Christian kingdoms were supposed to fight against each other versus how they would fight against, the heathen Muslims or whatever. There was some idea of, like, on religious lines of, we're Christendom, so we're going to treat each other with some degree of civility versus, the Moors or whoever it is that they were fighting, that you could be a little bit more savage with, and that was still okay with the Vatican.
Yeah, tell that to Constantinople, though.
Well, I'm not saying it's 100% there. I'm just saying what the party line was.
Yeah, that narrative of portraying the enemy as the villain has definitely always been there. But you don't need to be constrained whenever you're creating the reasons why a particular, like in your games, why a particular nation state decides to go to war for another. As we are recording this right now, hopefully this doesn't happen, but Russia looks like it might be poised to attack the Ukraine. And like, we can vilify the Russians as much as we want, but when it comes down to it, Putin isn't a cartoon villain.
I don't know. Have you seen the memes?
I've seen him shirtless wrestling bears, if that's what you mean.
It's, I don't think that there's anything wrong with creating bad guys that are superior to your party. Like, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think about, like, the Khans in ancient times. It's like the Goths invaded Rome. Well, why? Well, partly because of the pressure from the steppe warriors. I believe they were the Huns, were displacing a lot of those people. So, when we look back at European history, the Goths are definitely, seen as black and white, just kind of evil vandals, right? But in reality, they were just displaced people trying to find a new place, and that forced them into an antagonistic relationship. Something like that, I think, can be interesting to bring into a game. But ultimately, after eventually the Huns showed up on the Romans' door, and Kublai Khan was just like, oh God, I'm fucking this history up. I know I am, but you get the idea.
You're thinking Attila.
I'm thinking Attila, yeah. And Attila, he had no good intentions. He had no good intentions towards Rome, towards anyone else. He was just a straight up basic conqueror who did his thing. But the idea that the party, the party's ultimate destiny is to be in direct conflict with this one big bad, and their destiny is fixed on overthrowing that bad guy. Those games can be fun. I've played in a bunch of them, and they're a ton of fun. But the devil's definitely in the details, and it can definitely lead you down a path where you just put the game on rails. And I think, as we've established many times over the course of this podcast, at least in my opinion, when the game gets on rails, I think the party has less fun because they don't feel like they have agency. So when you're the DM and you're building them up to fight this one big bad, you can run the risk of really severely cutting the agency of your players. And they just don't feel good, as a player. You want to feel like you have control of your destiny, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one thing I would caution if you're going to be pulling one of these where the antagonist of the campaign isn't a bad guy. It's just somebody who is either ideologically or under the banner of a different nation state. Like, make that clear at the start that you're not going to have a campaign where you're going to have an evil person who you're going to grow to revile every time their name is spoken. I've seen it happen where I've been in a game where it was modeled after the Crusades. We didn't have full buy-in from all of the players that was exactly what we were going to be, that we were going to be Christian knights going on crusade. And we got to a point where some of the players in the party, they didn't see the point in fighting against the Muslims because they weren't evil. And so I don't want to be a bad guy, so I don't want to continue in this campaign. And the campaign fell apart because it broke that expectation of we're going to have a bad guy who we're going to fight.
Though on the other hand, I think that's a really interesting, that could be a very interesting plot to a game long term, is if you intentionally set out to be that way, that the players are going to eventually have the ability to see that maybe they're not on the 100% good side, and you put them in a decision point where they have to question, am I doing this for the right reasons? That I think is a very interesting turn for a group of players, but the DM has to be prepared for it. It's only when you march out this big bad or this big bad arc and the players are like, nah, dog, my chaotic neutral thief just ain't into this. I don't really care. You really have to decide at the beginning how it needs to play out so that your party doesn't create conflicting characters with your narrative. But I would caution also that if you have certain types of player characters that could be built that would be in conflict with your narrative, that might be a warning sign that maybe your narrative isn't where it needs to be.
Sorry, I was trying to very quickly look up who the from Kingdom of Heaven, the Knights Templar guy who was directly an antagonist for the main character of the movie, but he was also a Christian. So I'm pretty sure Guy was the prince of Jerusalem. But I'm misremembering.
Yeah, I guess it's true. The argument could be said in that particular example that, the antagonist was the zealot Christian crusader from France who just wanted war at all cost, even though, the king and most smart people realized that fighting the Muslims directly, was just a quick way to lose, and that's how the game, spoiler alert, that's how it happens.
And that can be a very interesting model to put your characters against, because that character was entirely legal in their position. They had every right by their system. That character had every right to command the knights that he had under his command and to do the things that he did. He didn't break any laws in doing all of those things. And so it puts the player characters in a particular bind where they have to do something about this, but they can't just kill him because that would be illegal. That would be morally wrong to attack and kill somebody who is your ally. Your player characters would suffer the repercussions of that and quite possibly throw your entire force, your entire army into disarray because you just killed one of their greatest generals.
This is one of those things that I think about a lot, about our modern morality and how it plays out in role-playing games versus what the the era in human history in which this is sort of, emulating or pantomiming or whatever what things were actually like at the time. Like you were talking about at the very beginning, Clayton, like people would just do what the king said because that's the right thing to do. Because you're born into a situation where you're told your whole life that whatever the king does is what God wants. And so by definition, anything that the king tells you to do is the right thing to do, no matter how horrible it might seem. It's hilarious how many times I've seen, the revolutionary fervor of modern moralizing playing out in a D&D group.
And the king himself feels the same way. That's the thing. It's everybody's in on the delusion,
Yeah, you can't even really talk about it like it's much of a scam. I guess, the priests are bullshitting about what God's telling them to do, but like everybody else down from that is full on believing like, yeah, I was born to the throne. Like, what argument do you have for me not being here? Like, it's absurd to think about.
Are there any advantages? We've trashed the whole big bad villain. Can we rehab it a little bit? Like, you bringing in the whole moral, modern thing. We've also said, at least I have a bunch in past episodes, that like sometimes D&D gaming, what have you, for a certain type of person, me in most cases, it's a refuge from the complexity of day-to-day life. And sometimes it is a relief to just go into a black and white situation and just, go fight the big bad or ultimately try to thwart the evildoer. I think that's the appeal of the fantasy genre in general. It's certainly, I think, a secret to the success of Tolkien. Is there a right way to pull that off? Is there anything wrong if that's the way how do you make that a compelling game?
I don't know if that, I agree with you, Eliot, that is a relief and is a big selling point for a certain piece of the role-playing experience. But I think people are probably unsatisfied if that's the totality of it. Like, I think that black and white, chop them up for, God and country simplicity is what you want for, like, your skirmishes and stuff. But when you're actually encountering, a significant NPC for an opposing side, I think people get much more interested when it's a lot more like, Game of Thronesy. So I don't know. I feel like there's probably some kind of double standard or some kind of, dichotomy of expectation there, depending on, how important the perceived importance of the villains that you're facing happens to be. You know what I mean?
And just because you're doing this doesn't mean that, like, you're not going, like, the entire campaign is going to be completely bereft of having that type of simplistic, like, here is enemy, we kill enemy. Like, this idea of having an enemy who can't just be chopped up, in my mind, that is more of a relatively high-level problem for the player characters to face, because whenever the player characters reach a certain power level, they can literally just kill or banish to another plane anything that gives them any sort of a problem. From everything that I've read, the game is really designed to have enemies who the players can't just do that to. The best enemies, particularly at that time, are the ones who are designed to stick around because they have a role to play in the greater world, and the player characters need to think about the consequences of their actions and realize that sometimes that expedient, let's just kill the bad guy, is going to lead to a whole lot worse consequences than a very long, drawn-out process of defeating the enemy in another way, such as by literally convincing them otherwise, or using like trying to create alliances between disparate groups of people. I see that as being what relatively high level D&D is all about, is that interpersonal conflict, rather than just being we take out our swords and spells and kill. Although that does eventually become, that is the culmination of all of that. But the high level play seems to be around presenting these types of gray area puzzles that the player characters need to work themselves through. And to have a single big bad, it really does just get to be too simplistic, especially for high level characters.
Yeah, I think a good two things from fiction that I think does this well is the Conan the Barbarian movie and even like the Highlander movies. Because I think one thing that we failed to mention that's a trope that is almost like I mean, they always go hand in hand. I can't think of a time I haven't had a big bad that also didn't have some apocalypse, mechanism also. It's like almost like lazy DMs, or just me being one of them. Is like, well, how do I engage these players with this bad guy since he's clearly too big for them to actually confront? Well, he's destroying the world. So, that's how the players get wrapped up in this, is that they have we'll put them on the clock, we'll create a puzzle or where we go collect, apocalypse tokens or, what have you, or take the ring and throw it in Mount Doom or whatever. But like, Thulsa Doom, he had ultimately, I guess he would have been a big threat to everybody, but really he was just a dude who had a cult in the middle of nowhere that occasionally went out and like killed people. I mean, there was no clock for Conan to kill him. Conan did all kinds of shit from the time that he, decided he wanted to kill Thulsa Doom until he actually got a chance to. And then on the other hand, in the Highlander suggestion, it was personal. The Kurgan, killed, was the one who put Connor MacLeod in the ground the first time and killed his family. And it took hundreds of years for them to actually confront each other. In fact, you could argue that Connor, intentionally didn't make an effort to find him for a long time, So, having a big bad, I think the best way, maybe a good way to engage the party with a bad guy that you want them to confront, but without actually stealing their agency, just have them fuck with them. Put it in their backstory. Or thumbnail some important NPCs or important places, things that matter to the players. And when you want to bring this big bag into the world or make it feel like, give the players a reason to really have it out for this particular path, go steal, go take away some of their treasures, have them destroy the keep they worked so hard to get, have them kill that beloved NPC, have them burn down their hometown, make it personal. Those types of details will motivate the party to go at an individual over the long run. But, there's no reason to put urgency into it as well. If you do, then that's what kind of irks me. That's what puts me on a rail. It's like, we got to do it now before they get the the major crystal that unlocks the destruction of the world. That to me just makes me want to puke.
Yeah, my favorite thing along these lines is to set up a powerful bad guy that is intimidating in their own right and has their goons and whatever. But the reason that the party doesn't just roll initiative immediately is because the villain has something that the party needs. And maybe it's information, maybe it's like an actual object, but they don't know where it is. Maybe it's a person. The cool thing about Conan with Thulsa Doom, he had the king's daughter there, who had joined the cult. So good villains surround themselves with hostages and collect things that people want. And then you get the opportunity, when you've kind of taken combat off the table, to slowly start corrupting player characters. You get them off their high horse. You make them make little compromises and cooperate with the villain for a greater good, sure, but you gotta make some sausage. And once the player characters start getting their hands dirty, I think a lot of the pretense of the knight in shining armor perspective, starts getting a little tarnished, and that's when interesting stuff starts happening, especially inter-party dynamics that flow out of that.
A lot of the best advice that I've read online when starting new campaigns and trying to figure out how I'm gonna how am I gonna think about this story arc is not being afraid to have a simple story. There's no reason to have this super complex, big, weaving storyline. Why not just? I think it works best when you keep it really simple, and that could even be have a big bad, but keep it simple and let the players give the players the ability to fill in the details, and just load the game with content. The simpler that you make your ultimate antagonist, or the simpler you make your arc, then you can focus more of your time on the individual session or the individual arcs and fill them with lots of interesting details. And kind of like what I was saying earlier, it's like, if you really want your party to really hate somebody, is grow a stable of a really fun, engaging NPCs, and then allow those NPCs to get, bond with them over time, doing these fairly simple quests, and just focus on making good characters in game. And then when it's time to roll out the big bad, then, when the big bad threatens those things that those players are really attached to, be it a locality like a town or a city or a group of people maybe they've befriended, then at that point they have developed such a bond that what's driving the game isn't the overarching narrative, it's the in-game relationships and in-game content that, in a lot of ways, the players themselves have made that keeps them wanting to go forward, towards your big bad when you want them to go there. But maybe this is getting too far away from the villain itself.
No, I don't think it's getting too far away from the villain. I wanted this to be just focusing on not necessarily a big villain, but anything that is encompassed by the label antagonist. And that doesn't have to mean it's the main villain of the campaign. It could be each of the individual people that you come across in the course of adventures, and maybe there is somebody who is an antagonist for a few sessions who the player characters really have no real reason to kill, but they are definitely a thorn in the player character's side. I keep using fantasy examples, but like in my example of having a completely incompetent or a king who is just fucking everything up, maybe the king isn't necessarily the antagonist, but maybe the antagonist is one of the advisors, and the player characters have no, if they wanted to take out the advisor, well, the result of that is that the player characters suddenly become outlaws, and they have to deal with the entirety of the kingdom looking out for them and trying to get their heads on a pike so that they can turn in the reward. Having those types of enemies who just don't like the player characters, I have seen that become an antagonist that the player characters remember more often than any of these big, huge bad guys who loom over the entirety of the campaigns. Those end up being ultimately forgettable. The characters that I have seen my players hate the most, and the ones that I remember hating the most, have been the incidental people I've, quote, met along the way who just piss me off, and there isn't a goddamn thing I can do about it. Jordan, the example that comes to my mind is from the Apocalyptia Factions game and the fucking commander of the military base. My character fucking hated that guy, and there was not a goddamn thing I could do to him.
Yeah, you were in very close physical proximity with him, and often when he did not have a terribly large entourage either, like in Ural's town.
And that can be so good as I think that's the sign of a really fun game, is that when you can nest your bad guys very closely with your parties, and they have their hands on their sword hilts the whole time, but they just fear the unintended consequences of making the bad move. That just reeks of a game that's a lot of fun. It's a sign you're doing something right.
Yeah, I think if you spend some time thinking about your cosmological or political or both ecosystem of power and like figure out, why these different entities continue to exist even though they are in opposition to other entities that are, within the setting. And, what kinds of things might happen if one would be removed from that ecosystem, and have an idea of like why everything would fall apart if you just, cut the head off the evil character. Like, what the fuck happens in Mordor, like the day after Frodo throws the ring into the volcano? Sauron's gone, but aren't there still like a billion fucking orcs running around? Like, that's the problem with those super simplistic two-sided kinds of stories, is that like, are you gonna go on some kind of like crazy extermination spree and just murder every single thing that is on the opposing side, or are you gonna try to find some equilibrium? Like, it's much more interesting when there's multiple elements kind of mixing together and playing off of each other.
Yeah, that's something that really isn't handled that I've seen either in the scope of campaigns, because usually when the big bad is dead, then the campaign is over. And movies, oh my God, movies, sci-fi movies have this trope down where you stop the big blue beam coming down from the sky and suddenly all of the enemies drop dead.
Yeah, it's that's the thing. It is a balancing act, I will say. I mean, it's just really difficult to run a game that has no ultimate terminus, but everybody always throttles forward to, well, then that means I've got to make a level 20, big bad paladin, evil necromancy, blah, or Lich King or some shit like that. There's nothing wrong with building your arc. Like, if we're talking about D&D, just don't think past level 10. Like, don't think past level 5. Get them thinking these small arcs and then let it build, because just the power curve of the game itself is almost going to force you to eventually introduce a very formidable bad guy just because of the power level of the players. You can almost put a pin in, as a DM, you almost put a pin in it, like knowing that eventually I'm going to have to confront these players with a very formidable foe once they get to the point where they can just wax almost anything less than a super evil bad guy. Why did you have to even introduce that? Why does there have to be foreshadowing? Why do you have to worry about like dropping little clues towards an eventual outcome that statistics say you're never really gonna unfurl? You're probably never gonna get to that fight. So, it feels a lot more satisfying if your bad guys, your antagonists, turn over at achievable, mile markers, and thinking in terms of much shorter arcs, even if you're thinking long-term game, I think can just be more manageable when you're running. And also for the players, I think can be a lot more fun, because then they can breathe. They don't have this urgency to go to save the world,
This is one of the things that I really like about the old school way of doing things, where, for one thing, you stop getting hit points at a certain level. The top end is, significantly stronger, but not like as huge of a jump from starting position to kind of your finished character. And when you die, you start over at the beginning, so there's like this constant like churn of player characters. And even if you do manage to be one of the really clever and lucky few that survive, you're still going to get your fucking bell rung by relatively common large challenges that might come around. This is one of those areas where game mechanics really affect the kind of stories that you tell with them, when you talk about like power curves and how that necessitates the arms race of villainy that comes out of that. I don't know, I definitely like keeping it lower so that everything is always kind of challenging, but you still have like a sense of accomplishment and, excitement.
I think one thing that can kind of get in the way of DMs, like me, I'll just keep using me as an example because I fall into this really bad. It's kind of the thing I'm trying to attack in me as a gamer in general, DM, I guess, is that sometimes when you're worried too much about your big bad or some overarching storyline, what you're really doing is you're neglecting, with your time and your prep, the thing that really matters to players the most, which is, session by session, enjoyable encounters. And, for me, I've always struggled to run combat well because I think I don't put a lot of thought and interest in design of combat. And playing in your game, Jordan, it's shown me that in the earliest days, it was flipped. The focus was on the dungeon. The focus was on the encounters, and what they populated those dungeons and those encounters with were almost secondary. It's like we're going to design this really cool dungeon. We're going to design this series of encounters that we think would be fun to play through and challenging. And I could even see that after the fact. It's like, well, who are these people once you've built it? It's like, okay, well, then you come up with it after the fact. Keeping a simple story and just focusing mainly on are these encounters going to be fun? In D&D 5e, it can be, there's a lot of ways to mix in really interesting combat, quirks. It's just you got to put in the time to design it. And I just know personally, I feel like I definitely neglect that because I want to put my thoughts into this big overarching story that ultimately the players are usually never going to interact with.
Yeah, I try to never design more than what I can confidently foresee will actually be content in the game. Like whenever I'm trying to do an entire campaign arc, for one thing, I don't design in D&D level 1 to 20 campaigns anymore. I have done that enough times and had the campaigns fizzle out before level 10 enough times to realize that everything that I designed after level 10 is just wasted time and wasted energy that I could have put into making the game better at the early and mid levels. So the way I design the campaigns is I design an arc at a time, and I just create the skeleton. And that skeleton will include some people who have kind of abrasive personalities, and I'll just let the interaction with the player characters determine whether or not the player characters end up hating them or not. And then if they end up hating them, well, then I know exactly who one of the main villains coming up is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think putting more thought in, like, for instance, when you guys ran through Strahd, I started off with Curse of Phandelver, and, like, in this situation, the bad guy, I think the spider, I think it's the black spider, he's a pud. He's, like, not much of a bad guy, but he just happened to escape. And so, like, in the background of the rest of the game, like, I kept dangling that guy out there, and it was just totally accidental, but, I had no plans on that being there, but I would even forget about him sometimes until, like, a player would I'm going to go ask this guy if they've seen the black spider. I was like, oh, yeah, that guy. Oops. What's he doing? You know what I mean? But the players will definitely fill in the content for you. Games are not about the bad guy. They are about the NPCs. I would say that's just it. Like, the game lives and dies by how much fun they're having day to day, and having fun NPCs, interesting locations, that will generate so much of your content for you.
I kind of feel like we're kind of... All right, guys. So the last thing I want to bring up is talking about how to use as an antagonist, because this really isn't an enemy per se, but the whole idea of man versus nature. Like, forces of nature are very much things that people struggle against, people have to fight against. And this could be a natural disaster. More often, I see this manifest as something like in apocalyptic scenarios, like a plague or zombies or things like that. Things that aren't actually a thinking enemy, but it's just something that the player characters just have to struggle against because It's there, it's in their face, they have to deal with it. It's not a physical enemy in the same way that you have a big bad for the campaign. Jordan, you have run more zombie and post-apocalyptic campaigns in this vein than anybody else I know. How do you go about creating this type of thing as the quote enemy that the player characters have to deal with the entirety of a campaign?
Yeah. So you change what the win condition is. Like when you're fighting Sauron, the win condition is to destroy the ring and thereby kill Sauron. When you're fighting a zombie apocalypse, it's sort of like, the aftermath of the Return of the King. Like I mentioned, like you've just got a sea of adversaries to deal with. There is no way really to wipe them out as one player character. So the game isn't to kill all the bad guys. The game is to retain your humanity in a situation where you have so many opportunities to basically go feral. The kinds of villains that you throw at people in situations like that, like, see The Walking Dead, see Negan, the governor, like these kinds of characters, they basically lost. And there's cool, like, symbolic inversion stuff that happens because the world's, completely turned on its head. The dead are walking, the living are dying, and the people who are in charge of large groups of other people and have made themselves petty kings have basically lost the game because they've become, fucking savages. And that takes a toll on them in one way or the other. So yeah, that's a pretty lengthy way of going at it. Did I answer anything that you asked?
Yeah, absolutely. So you also touched upon something else I wanted to talk about, and kind of in this same vein, and that is the fact that in that particular scenario and in a lot of these disaster scenarios, the corruption of the individual is as much the enemy of the campaign as any physical person that the player characters may come against. It's the fight of retaining oneself. That is dramatic, and it is fucking amazing to see player characters actually get into it and living through the consequences of their actions whenever their characters feel like they're in a life or death situation where they don't have any good options. They can't be the heroes. They have to just choose the lesser of evils in order to see the next day. It can be very bleak. It can be very, very heavy and hard to get through if it's something that you just keep doing. I think it works really great for like short-term campaigns. It's something that I love exploring in my games.
Gosh, good points. I love the zombie apocalypse scenario as a basis for a game. I don't even think they have to be short run. I think they have a lot of staying power if you want to. There's just a lot of rich content in a game like that, especially trying to break it away from zombie games. Even if it's just like a paradigm shift kind of a game. The zombie game comes to my mind in that like I ran one not too awful long ago where, one of the subplots that the players just got a ton of play out of was just some people just not giving up on the way things were. And so like, I remember I had a character who's like the manager of a state park who in the pre-world, was just the default leader and had all the skills to keep it running in normal life. But then when this happened, it was like he was still like trying to assert himself as the leader, and he wasn't prepared for this. You've got like enclaves of people you can go save, and then you have to put the players in moral positions where they have to go weather the danger of the world itself. Is it worth it? Is it worth going to save these people? And then you can turn. Those games are really fun. One thing before I get too long-winded about this is I think that you've done a good job, Jordan, changing my mind on even in basic fantasy, making us keep track of rations and things. I've always hated that in games in the past, but you've put us in a game right now where it's a pretty desolate stretch of distance that we've had to go away from locations. And I was getting really anxious as our rations and things are ticking away. When you put players out and force them to hold on to that, like, I don't know, there's something to be said about the bean counting of resource management that can generate some interesting tension in game, because, like, if, you give the players a left or right and they go the wrong way, they could run themselves out of rations, and, like, that itself could generate a ton of fun. Things like that, just weather, getting lost, simply just not knowing where you're going, like just giving, the players the opportunity to be lost and being prepared for that as a DM. These players are going to a place they don't know and they don't have good guidance on how to get there, and it's a real possibility they can get lost. Giving yourself enough time to prepare for that eventuality when the players ultimately do, that can actually be pretty fun.
Yeah, and in the roots of Dungeons and Dragons, like the very primordial DNA of the thing is a game from Avalon Hill called Outdoor Survival. And it's so important that it's listed as an essential item to have in the old white box Men and Magic original D&D player handbook. It had a hex map on it and a bunch of shit about, like, here's forests, here's trails, here's rivers. And you had to keep track of your food and water and navigation. Like, there are no navigation rules in that version of D&D. It says use the rules from the Avalon Hill game. And in that Avalon Hill game, it gets fairly complicated, but one of the things that fucks you is that if you get lost, you roll a d6 and just go off in a random direction on this hex map, and you're just blowing through your food and water doing that, trying to figure out where the fuck to go. Like, how do you have an interesting desert crossing without managing resources, or managing your warmth if you're trying to climb over snow-capped mountains or through the tundra or whatever? You could reasonably argue that nature itself was our very first enemy, and I think making people combat that as a frail human or humanoid character, that's chock full of interesting adventure opportunity. I think I don't want to fast travel.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why Dark Sun has always been one of my favorite D&D campaign settings, is because it's set in a desert world. From reading the literature that is in the books, you get lost out in the desert without water, you are dead. You are in a very bad way there. And so even in D&D, you're essentially screwed if you go out, if you don't have a plan and you just wander the desert. Well, that's a good way of getting your character killed.
And it's not just like building tension for you, like, oh shit, are the dice gonna fuck me and my character just dies because of dehydration rules or whatever. I saw hints of this happening with you specifically, Eliot, when people started being like, hey, how many rations you guys got? Who's got a water skin? Like, how are we looking on that inventory? And, as things start getting a little leaner, people start kind of side-eyeing around, kind of running through some scenarios, like, worst comes to worst, it's not going to be me that starves to death,
Yeah, I mean, just again, it takes some subtlety. I do think it takes some subtlety to know when that's getting tiring. I think you need to plan you have to plan very intentionally. For instance, like, I dabbled with the thought, I will eventually run this game, but it's a pretty much straight up simulator of prehistory, where you're playing like either recently settled farmers or hunter-gatherers, and for whatever reason you have to make a long-distance trek, as they did from time to time. And, by about day 8 or 9 of watches and rations and being lost in water, and if you're the DM and you just know, like, they're going nowhere, like, oh my god, they're so lost, the game is going to quickly devolve into, deer hunting simulator, foraging simulator. It's like you're going to spend half a session just them reaccumulating enough food and water to continue to travel, and that could be kind of tiring. But have in your back pocket like a secret temple that is, independent of a location. You just kind of have it in your back pocket to where, if I'm going to introduce these players the opportunity to get lost, then if things start to, if things start to lose momentum and the players are getting gritty, then have something in your back pocket to throw at them. But I do think that just not giving it any sort of respect, which I've definitely been guilty of in the past, pulls out an essential element. It really, as a DM, it makes life harder for you too, because you have to if you fast travel, essentially, you're going from content to content. You have to be fully prepared. Having interesting travel that eats up time, but can still stay fun, is just a huge burden off of you as the DM too.
It takes a lot of prep to be spontaneous like that.
Sure does.
It does. And that's kind of how you got to approach building your game.
Are we ready to move on to geek things? We're getting a little long.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, we'll move on to geek things, but I don't have any geek things this time, so you guys will have to carry us out to the end of the episode.
God, I've been thinking about this whole time in the back of my mind. I've been really loaded down with work and shit. I haven't been doing a whole lot of geek things. I will throw something out there. My boss recently, we finished Book of Boba Fett. Like I'm sure everybody's watched Book of Boba Fett by now, and it has its highs and lows. But the one thing I love about the new Star Wars series on Disney Plus is that they're slowly building a future for Star Wars, and they're pulling heavily from the cartoons, the Clone Wars, Rebels, the Bad Batch, and I had really never watched those. After Book of Boba Fett, I was like, I have to know some of this backgrounding if Dave Filoni is going to continue to pull in his stuff from Clone Wars and stuff. So I went and rewatched I finished Rebels. I had watched the first couple seasons years ago and enjoyed it, but dropped it. I powered through the rest of the series, and it is magnificent. I would really recommend any Star Wars fan who's looking forward to any new properties, you need to take this downtime, go watch Clone Wars, go watch Bad Batch, get caught up on these cartoons, because A, they're just really good, and B, we're going to be seeing a lot more of these characters in the future. So that's my geek thing. Go back and rewatch the Star Wars cartoons if you haven't already.
All right, my geek thing is kind of weird because it's been around for a while and it's a very, very niche kind of thing. But so I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan. I've never read the books. I only recently finished watching all the movies. I liked them, but whatever. Not a fanboy of that franchise by any stretch. But god damn it, if you get a chance to go to Universal Studios and check out the fucking Harry Potter stuff that they got going on there, that is the most fun I've ever had at a theme park. Universal split up into 3 different sub-parks, and the Harry Potter stuff, unfortunately, is split between 2, so you have to buy, kind of the pass or whatever to get between them. But you ride a fucking train, just like, going to Hogwarts. The little towns, the alley in the town that they've set up for these things is just so immersive. It's everything.
Diagon Alley is dope.
Dude, they've got this fucking dragon sitting on top of the Gringotts Bank building, and every 10 minutes this thing starts grumbling, and then it roars, and then it blows a fucking fireball over your head down the street, and you feel the fucking heat on your face. It is fucking dope. Go to Harry Potter World. Check that shit out. The rides are fucking cool. The food is fucking amazing. I've never had good food at a fucking theme park before, but man, even just the fucking shops are cool. Just walking around and just being fully fucking immersed in all this stuff. 10 out of 10 Universal Studios. You fucking knocked it out of the park with the Harry Potter shit. Fucking love it. I'm gonna go back probably another time if I can, or more.
And bring a fucking bank account, because there ain't nothing cheap in that place.
That's true.
That's true. I spent an embarrassing amount of money on 3 wands. That was a fun experience in and of itself. Can I steal your geek thing real quick, Clayton? Because another thing popped into my head. I'll make it short. Name of the Wind, Patrick Rothfuss. I'm reading that book right now. I've struggled to find a decent fantasy book. I feel like I found it. It's great. That's all I'll say. Just if you're looking for an audiobook or something and you got just a credit or whatever, you just want to throw at something, give it a shot. It's really fucking good. Really good. And it's not overwhelming. It's only 3 books. They're big books. I'm only about halfway through the first book, but it seems attainable, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. Good stuff. Mwah.
All right, guys. What do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.